So I would like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay respect to their elders past and present, and to the elders of all communities that this conversation reaches. I remind everyone that we are all living on stolen Aboriginal lands, and that we cannot have a conversation about power and accountability on these lands without recognising the ongoing impacts of white colonialism and state violence. I also recognise that as a white woman and a product of settler society, I am complicit in and benefit from that dispossession. My name is Sarah McCook. I am a masculinity and gender violence researcher, currently completing my PhD through RMIT University. I have the privilege today of hosting the panel discussion on men and masculinity in Australia, and this event is presented by the Wheeler Centre in partnership with Our Watch as part of their National Media Engagement Program. So following the event, Cameron McDonald from Our Watch will be writing a reflective essay on the panel, which will be hosted on the Wheeler Centre website along with the panel recording for future viewing. So I'd also like to recognise that we'll be discussing men's violence against women today and other impacts of masculinity for men and others, including men's mental health. So we'll share contact details after the panel for support lines if this conversation raises any issues for you or you'd like to talk to somebody about them. So please, I ask that you look after yourself and be mindful of how you're engaging with and responding to the content. So it is my great pleasure to introduce the panellists for today. We're joined this evening by Shaun Braybrook, who is a proud Aboriginal man who follows his grandfather line to the Kuku Yalanji people. Shaun has been working with the Victorian Koori community for almost 28 years and is currently the General Manager of the Wulgunggo Ngalu Learning Place on Gunai country, which provides Aboriginal men with an opportunity to reconnect with their culture and divert themselves from the justice system. We're also joined by Tarang Chawla, who's a Melbourne-based writer, gender equality and mental health advocate, and the founder of Not One More Niki, a campaign to end men's violence against women. Tarang's advocacy and media work is often centred on addressing men's violence, rigid patterns of masculinity and racism within Australia. He's an ambassador for Our Watch, White Ribbon, Carlton Respects, and was recently appointed to the Victorian Multicultural Commission. And we have Lech Blaine joining us, a writer from country Queensland whose work explores the dynamics of class, masculinity, mental health, and Australian mythos. Lech is the author of the memoir Car Crash and the recent quarterly essay Top Blokes, The Larrikin Myth, Class and Power. His writing has also appeared in The Monthly, Guardian Australia, The Best Australian Essays, Griffith Review, Kill Your Darlings and Mean Gin. So thank you again to the panellists for joining us this evening and for your really insightful comments on what I'm sure is going to be a great discussion. So what kind of stories do we tell about men, and what are the dominant cultural narratives of men and masculinity in Australia, and how are those narratives reproduced? Shaun, I'd love to turn to you first and ask, recognising that white coloniality is in many ways the foundation of masculinity in Australia, could you speak for us to how it is that colonisation has shaped and continues to shape those dominant stories about men, and particularly First Nations men?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah. And I too would like to begin by acknowledging the country that everyone's on, and especially the country for me down here in Gippsland. So I'm on the Gunai people's land down here in Gippsland. Pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and all the other country members out there as well. I think we got the raw end of the stick, Aboriginal men here, when we talk about masculinity and the way it was settled, the way Australia was settled, and how it shapes us as well. But I think there's a couple of important things to point out as well. Before the impact, before the invasion, the settlement, and whatever we like to call it, we had complex systems in place, totemic systems in place, kinship systems in place. They were very important for us, and there was a real equality amongst men and women. So we were both equal. That was class in our settings. Men and women were equal in a cultural setting. So that's very important, I feel, to point out as well in that. The whole equalness of our nation, of our group of our Aboriginal people. So then with white settlement and the invasion, saw real acts of genocide taking place on us, and especially the impacts that it had on Aboriginal men and everyone else you know, and them impacts things like the stolen generation, the removal of our children, the White Australia policies that were in place, and all these things that really impacted Aboriginal men and Aboriginal people as a whole, and that as well. And that's led to a lot of injustices as well. You know, Aboriginal people, we're incarcerated at a rate higher than non-Indigenous people, and still goes on today. And a lot of that incarceration is poverty, homelessness, you know, extreme levels of violence and that we see in our family, disadvantage and racism and that as well that we see. So that's the work that I do with our men. We look to rebuild our men and help our men through that challenge, and the important steps forward for our men to address that sort of the issues and the problems that they face around that as well. So that's where I find myself a lot with a lot of the talk around masculinity and that, and very important for the work that we do. We take a real cultural approach, and by strengthening men's cultural identity and rewriting some of the wrongs of yesterday to empower our men to follow a cultural path and understand a cultural path, that's the way that we move forward within our program, and definitely the way that I move forward as a man as well, by being strong in cultural identity, understanding that and moving forward. A lot of our men don't have the opportunity to practice cultural protocols, dance, do a smoking ceremony, and the strength of that when someone does, and you show them that way forward. So I hope that covers a bit.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shaun. So, Lech, I'd love to turn to you now. Your recent quarterly essay really speaks to the role of the media in circulating political representations and myths of the Australian man and the idealised Australian man in quite particular terms. And through that, masculinity and power are really positioned as an undercurrent to those myths. And sort of noting what Shaun has already spoken to around the history of White Australia policy and dispossession and invasion, I wonder if, Lech, you could reflect on the ways in which that idealised Australian male, white male, is also reproduced through that storytelling within the media.
Well, yeah, this is one of the great contradictions in Australian life, I think, is that a lot of the qualities that we lionise in white men, we turn back around and often demonise, especially in Aboriginal men, and you see it so frequently with certain athletes that, or just within general society that that we. If you look at a lot of these characteristics that we celebrate about the Australian larrikin in terms of binge drinking, in terms of promiscuity, in terms of the relationship that they have with women, and then you look at the way that we demonise Aboriginal communities across this country for things like the consumption of alcohol and what happened with the in the NT, like which isn't that long ago, and so there's this great contradiction in the way that we look at white masculinity and the way that we look at Aboriginal masculinity, and yeah, I think that that's one of the things that we often talk about the issues in Indigenous communities, but we don't look at a lot of the positive aspects that come from the way that they talk about family, the way that they often really privilege the women in those communities, and so yeah, I think that there's actually there's certainly a reorientation that needs to happen in the way that the way that we talk about masculinity, and the way that we also certainly racialise positive aspects of Australian identity and then exclude vast swathes of people from those identities.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Lech. And now, Tarang, you are very actively engaged in media across different platforms, including social media and elsewhere. And even for you in the past 2 weeks, I think you've had a few different experiences that really speak to these contradictions and tensions for men of different backgrounds within this kind of space. So I wonder if you could speak to what some of the dominant stories of Australian men and masculinity are that you encounter in those spaces.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Sarah. I think that from my perspective, one of the, I need to preface my response with why I'm active on social media in the first place. And one of the reasons for that is that, as a first generation migrant and person of color, in a country that is founded upon the dispossession of its native inhabitants and then the effects of colonialism, that's only continued for, as Shaun touched on with Aboriginal men in particular and Aboriginal masculinities and understanding of Aboriginal men. And as Lech has pointed out, it's only continued in terms of the dominant narratives around Larrikinism and how it's maligned on certain cultural groups. So for me, all of my campaigning and advocacy has taken place primarily in an online forum because that was the only space that was available to me. Men of color or people of color broadly are offered fewer opportunities to be able to speak our truth or our life experience in a public forum that goes to the rest of the mainstream of Australia. So, I've been quite active in that space, and over time, I've noticed certain dominant narratives around how, particularly, all men of color, especially observing the way that Aboriginal men are treated, it's quite confronting at times that there is this dominant narrative around how if we take the example of masculinity and violence against women, for instance, we see often in these online narratives that men who uphold the rigid ideas of masculinity will often be celebrated after they've committed one of the most heinous crimes known to humankind. Like we saw when Hannah Clark was killed alongside her 3 children, that her estranged husband, Rowan Baxter, was celebrated in the media as someone who, yes, had done this horrible crime, but actually was an accomplished rugby player, footballer, and it's focused on all of these things that were they're almost like tantamount to putting him up on a pedestal, but for the one horrible thing that he did. And there's countless examples of that. And I've seen this kind of dominant narrative play out where on the other end of things, when either myself or any person of color, particularly men, will comment on issues of race or other forms of discrimination, that we'll often be labeled adversely, as being aggressive or being bullying or vicious or anything that, or ferocious, and all we need to do is make an inquiry. So, for instance, quite recently, in the last couple of weeks, speaking about the issues around the COVID-19 vaccine and government mandates and use of words like segregation and their loaded history and the obvious continued impacts on First Nations peoples of words and language like that. Not to say that it's monolithic, that everybody from those communities agrees, but there are some dominant themes that come through. And so in that, I've seen this way that certain men have had masculinity maligned, much to Lech's point, that if certain paradigms are upheld by men of certain communities, they're not celebrated, but in fact they're actually held down for doing so. So it's this kind of inherent contradiction in how masculinity is viewed within broader Australian culture.
Yeah, thanks, Tarang. And certainly that element of contradiction comes through so clearly in the way each of you have spoken. So as each of you have been speaking as well, what really comes through is the direct impacts of these dominant narratives of masculinity, whether that is as white masculinity or othered masculinities. But there are these direct impacts for both men and others in their lives. And you've spoken to experiences of mental health, to gendered violence, as well as the kind of structural oppression and discrimination that First Nations men experience. So moving kind of from that space, I'd be interested for you to expand a bit more on how you see or have seen the impacts of these dominant patterns of masculinity for men and others. So Shaun, you spoke briefly before about what some of the impacts of sort of cultural tropes of white masculinity and dispossession have been for the men that you work with. I wonder if you can expand a bit more on how you see those intersections of masculinity and whiteness and carceral logics playing out for men in the Koori community.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And definitely for me, being a proud Aboriginal man, a Cook and Yawanji man, and a father, a son, and have two daughters. Oh, sorry, I have three daughters and a son and that as well. So very, very important for me to ensure they understand their Aboriginality as well. My partner's a non-Indigenous woman as well. So, our role in bringing up our children is to ensure that they have a safe environment, that they can grow up and be strong individuals in their own right, and that caring and loving environment as well. My role as an Aboriginal man is to ensure that they understand their culture, they have the opportunity to practice their culture, and then I pass on the knowledge to them as well and share that responsibility across that as well. And that's what I base my life on as well, and especially with the work that I do with our men as well. But I might touch on some of the things that we do as well. Is we're involved with a local football club down here as well with the work that I do with Wulgunggo Ngalu Learning Place. And football clubs can be what they are, and challenging places at times for masculinity and men and behaviours and that sort of stuff as well. The football club have really accepted what we do culturally within the club, that leads to a real understanding of Aboriginal culture in that as well, and where we find ourselves, and the strengthening of that as well. So in hand for that, yes, it's great benefit for the football club to see that. But then when we talk about working with some of our really complex men that might be involved in them situations, the real positive light that them men can be put in and seen within the club, especially when we might practice a ceremony down there, might do a smoking for NAIDOC week, or the different things that we've done around the club in a cultural sense. It really plays out really well in that sense as well for the men. Really gives them that strength that moves forward. So for me, it's always about your Aboriginality, sharing culture, understanding culture, being strong in your identity as an Aboriginal man, and that really strengthens who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Shaun. And it's so great to hear about some of the work that you've been doing, and particularly noting ways to interact with that wider community through places like the football club, which is such an important community space. Tarang, I'd like to turn to you now. How do these narratives tie into the kind of structural inequality and gendered violence that we do observe within Australian society?
They can't be separated. They go hand in hand. I think one of the things, though, about any discussion of masculinity is we often talk about, and there's a lot of research to back up, that men who use gender-based violence often have sort of like a more rigid adherence to certain patterns of masculinity. But I think one of the things is that we can't remove those from the discussion of intersectionality, but B, also a discussion of how when we address these factors around masculinity, we have to be quite clear about what our end goal is. A lot of work around masculinity often addresses men, and therefore and men alone, and therefore doesn't account for the diversity of gendered groups and gender minorities, and particularly doesn't account for women. And I think one of the things around any discussion of this is that it can't be removed from patriarchy and patriarchal thinking, that we have to acknowledge that while some of the things that we discuss can be, and some of the adherence to certain ideals of masculinity can be detrimental to men, we have to understand that men exist in concert with women, and women bear the brunt of the consequences of that. And I think one of the things that is sometimes lacking, particularly from groups and organizations, particularly in sort of mainstream Australian culture that work with men, is they'll focus primarily on men as both the subjects and agents of change, rather than thinking that this exists beyond them. And so I think one of my goals, and one of the things that I try to advocate for, is that we have to put this in a broader scheme. When we address other groups, we think of them as they relate to the broader community. I think we need to do the same with men. Otherwise, we end up furthering that patriarchal construct almost unwittingly. Like we might necessarily improve emotional intelligence, improve certain well-being, but we're not dismantling the power structures that inherently benefit men. And I think that that's something that's so key and crucial to actually addressing the root cause of a lot of these problems. Is going beyond just the awareness raising and understanding in the people who occupy these behaviors, myself included, as someone who benefits from certain degrees of male privilege. There's a need to understand that and acknowledge that, then go beyond to go, how do I as an individual and as a collective, do we dismantle that so that we can actually get past this kind of framework of patriarchal thinking that came to this country with the advent of colonialism, the gender binary, all of this stuff that's so rigid and taken for granted in dominant Western thinking, is something that across cultures is not as normalized, but has become normalized through the advent of colonialism. I think it needs to be addressed in a very broad way in order to actually turn the dial forward. Otherwise, we'll get a little bit of it, and certainly we'll see some positive outcomes as a consequence of that, but we won't get to the root cause of the problem, I don't think.
Yeah, thanks, Tarang, and such an important point to highlight as well about addressing the root cause and recognising what that is and what that looks like. And I'd love to come back to your point there about accountability in a moment. Turning to Lech, you have written kind of your own personal reflections on navigating masculinity, or kind of, as Tarang has spoken to, those expectations around men and emotionality. And so I wonder if you could speak to some of those personal reflections for you on navigating these expectations around masculinity, as well as what the implications are for men who don't kind of fit with that story or mythos of the white Aussie bloke.
Well, yeah, I certainly fit within. I'm a white straight bloke from Queensland, so I wouldn't want to downplay the privileges that I've grown up with, but certainly within those traditions, I grew up in a pub in Queensland, surrounded by very sort of macho, a very macho environment, and yeah, like anyone growing up, I struggled at times in terms of the expectations that I faced, and so whether that was something like sport, like I was never good at sport, even though most of the people that I was surrounded by in that environment had been athletes of one kind or another, and so that led to me because of physically and athletically, I couldn't measure up to my brothers or my extended family. It led to me overcompensating for that by um, binge drinking from a pretty young age. Like I started drinking when I was 13, and drinking to excess. So that became a way for me to maybe mask some of the anxiety that I felt or self-consciousness that I felt about these things, and really adopt this persona which I'd watched so closely growing up, which was this Larrikin figure, and really that was the type of person that I wanted to mimic and become, and that you know ended up presenting a lot of issues. I was in a beyond the normal identity issues of being a teenager. I was in a car accident when I was 17 that killed three of my friends, and there was certainly like major trauma from that event, and also all of these rituals about masculinity that I'd grown up with meant that I couldn't actually process this event that I'd just been through, and so the grieving process for that event was completely stunted, and I wasn't able to cry, I wasn't able to express any emotion, and yeah, it took me a long time and a lot of further sort of emotional tumult to begin to unpack why it was that I couldn't express my emotions and how I'd gotten into this position to begin with, which, as I said, really goes back to the heart of this dominant identity within white Australia, which is the Larrikin, and that was certainly the tradition that as I said, that my family, my dad sort of came from that tradition, and I was really trying to measure up to that.
Yeah, thanks, Lech. And certainly your recent essay really emphasises the power and influence that myth of the larrikin carries through kind of Australian identity more broadly, and the way that we see that play out in kind of political representations and what that means for how these kind of traits like empathy and compassion and stuff get kind of implicitly excluded from political conversations. So as you've kind of been speaking to, there are these really clear links between narratives about masculinity, the structures of gender inequality and discrimination in Australia, along with men's violence and men's kind of interactions even with the criminal justice system. We also see that relationship has been confirmed in the research, and this is where Our Watch's research and work with preventing violence has really come through to emphasise the importance of really actively working to engage men and address masculinity. And as Tarang, you kind of highlighted before, accountability is really a key element of this work, and certainly is a point that Our Watch's frameworks around addressing masculinity have highlighted as well. So I'd love to talk to you now. What does accountability look like in this work of rewriting and reformulating masculinity and men's experiences? And how can we think about accountability in terms of media representations of men and masculinity and gendered violence? So Shaun, I'd love to ask you first. What does accountability mean or look like to you, particularly in your own work and working with the queer community?
Yeah, definitely accountability. It's very important for the work that I do. You know, I want to be a man that's accountable for his actions and shares that to others. So if I say I'm going to do something, it's done as well. And also hold other men accountable in that space. Very, very important, especially for the work that I do here at Wulgunggo Ngalu. We have a set of principles out here. We call it the rules of the dreaming, cultural principles, and they are preserve the dream by order and ritual. So everything has a place, and we must follow that. Take care of the environment, responsible for your own actions, and pass on the knowledge. So these are some of the things that we go into more depth with the men out here around that whole accountability framework and that as well. You know, and ensure that men understand that. We invite men in our men's circles to come and look at themselves and look at their accountability, see if they are out of place, see where they do need to work on, and to address whatever needs to be addressed. Sometimes that's real challenging for men. Sometimes we get it right, and sometimes men aren't ready for them conversations and that as well. And it takes a little bit of time to work through that accountability and for men to understand that. But very important for me as an Aboriginal man to be accountable in that space, especially for the work that I do around that as well. So we do challenge that. We do challenge our violent behaviours. We do challenge our anger. We do challenge the behaviours that our men see get them in trouble and incarcerated as well, and look to address them and see what they need to do. So takes a little bit of time to work. It's never easy. It's never over quickly. It's a long process, and it's definitely the accountability lays the foundation for that. If you're not accountable, men will see through that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Shaun. And Tarang, I wonder if you can speak a little more to your own reflections on accountability, as you said, working as a man within this kind of space, both as an advocate and ambassador for change in preventing gendered violence.
I really like some of the stuff that Shaun has already touched on around leading by example, you know, like that accountability. If you take the example of like men's behavior change, if the practitioner themselves is not holding themselves accountable and holding that space in the appropriate manner, then there's quite a, you know, people, men, women, gender diverse people alike, everyone has a pretty strong bullshit radar and an ability to be able to sort of perceive if there's inauthenticity from the facilitator or from the, you know, from the practitioner. So I think that's something that's really crucial in terms of that specific part of the work. In terms of the broader narrative around masculinity and doing this work, one of the things that I think is so crucial is striking the right balance between responsibility and accountability, and also a space for the expression of emotion. One of the problems I think for for men trying to seek support and help is that there is a, you know, regrettably a shame and a stigma associated with the concept of seeking help. You know, so men who find themselves as perpetrators of abuse and violence, whether it's against other men, whether it's against women or intimate partners or their families, men who are holding space as abusers in these relationships, when they self-refer to seek help, they're often further shunned by society at large. When I think, in actual fact, someone who is admitting I have a problem and I need to fix this because this is having a detrimental impact on the people around me, I don't think we should be celebrating them. That's not what I'm arguing at all. What I'm saying, though, is that we shouldn't compound that, because that degree of vulnerability is actually going against the dominant narrative that is sold to men, which is that you are perfect, you know exactly what you're doing, and I think that one of the things that there's certain strength in that to open yourself up to that vulnerability to do the work. And I think that we need to create a space that holds men accountable with reference to who's actually most at harm. And I think what we're doing at the moment is, regrettably, a small section of society, generally those who are, predominantly white cisgender men from a certain class group, upper middle class, are celebrated when they open up about things that subvert the dominant masculine paradigm, and everyone else is shamed and shunned, right? And I think that we need to create a space that is broader for more types of men to come forward with the issues that they experience, and not shame them or shun them, but actually create a space for them to have the community and to work on their issues to become better men. Because I think that we live in a time where, and I don't think this is going to change quickly, and there's also arguments that it need not change, but in much the same way that, women sometimes will seek the solace and comfort of other women for shared lived experience, the idea that men will listen to other men is something that need not be a problem. It's only a problem if those men listen to other men only because of patriarchal thinking and because they view women differently. But the idea of sharing the common experience of manhood and masculinity is actually not a weakness in and of itself. It can be a strength to help elevate the idea of what healthy and positive masculine behavior looks like. And I think that if we start shifting towards that, creating space for men, to be able to express that, have the open, honest conversation, and then do the work, we get a truer picture of accountability. It's not just purely shame and then thinking that the behavior is going to change. It's actually allowing them to equip themselves with the tools to go into their communities later and then become what we want to see, which is effective bystanders. So it's basically about space for them to do the work, I would say, is something that's crucial and has to shift.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tarang. And certainly that point that you were highlighting around being mindful about the impact or potential influence of men's peer relations as a source of change or as a potential barrier is such an important one, particularly in this conversation around accountability. Lech, I'd love to sort of shift gears slightly to talk to you around accountability. One of the points that you speak to in the essay is this kind of intersection of class and stigma, and the way that that has been kind of mobilised in particular ways by the powerful elites, by the media, in ways that maintain kind of a particular system of patriarchal governance within Australia. So I wonder, what might it look like for the Australian media to produce more inclusive storytelling around masculinity while also being able to kind of hold men accountable in those stories? And what are the implications around some of the existing relationships between powerful men and media for changing those cultural narratives of Australian masculinity?
Yeah, well, I think that Tarang made a great point in the sense about class, and that the media sometimes embraces vulnerability without full accountability, or without fully articulating the way that a lot of these issues could be alleviated by further government investment in terms of mental health services, and so that the people who can access help and is that isn't spread evenly across society. So if you look at and that also goes for the justice system as well. Like there's a certain group of men who are more readily who are more both when they mess up, they are more forgiven more easily by the justice system, but they also have the economic support to pursue psychological help and in an unlimited way. And I was a beneficiary of that. Like after the accident I was in when I was 17, when I was 18, I got picked up for drink driving. I'm sure that if I'm sure that if I had have been an Aboriginal man in the same situation who'd been picked up for drink driving, um, the the judge would have been a lot less sympathetic. I sort of received a slap on the wrist. I was in a position where my sister was at university studying psychology, and so she was able to access me psychological help through her lecturer. And so just like which these are things which can which changed my life certainly, and that's why I'm here talking about it now, and that's why I've written a book about it. That's why I had the skills to be able to do that. It hasn't been an easy journey, but it took it took those tangible, especially when you talk about something like uh, cheap access to a psychologist. Like these these benefits aren't evenly spread across society, and that it makes it harder to break the cycle for men who do actually want to seek help. And so, yeah, I think that in terms of the broader effect of that, like as I said, the media treat perpetrators of certain crimes differently depending on who they are. And if you're a white middle class male, then you're going to be treated a lot differently, and you're going to receive more sympathy both publicly, both in terms of the judicial system, both in terms of the support that you're able to actually receive. And so I hope that when we have these mental health weeks, it's not just a chance for people to speak publicly and make those admissions and receive some sort of catharsis. Although I think that can have a really positive effect, I think that also needs to be joined with like a conversation about the fact that we need to be investing a lot more resources into all sorts of social programs that will actually help men. And that goes back to this, it's a different conversation than one we're having today, but that goes back to the whole idea about that in Australia about what the role of government. And we have governments that sometimes want to that jump on board with with the idea about mental health while not adequately not adequately funding them. And so I think that we should that should be a big part of this conversation as well, is how we actually funding the sort of programs that will help people break the cycle of bad behavior and depression and all these other sorts of issues.
Yeah, thanks, Lech. And I wonder that point that you're coming to there around governance or government and the kind of systems or programs that are being put in place. Shaun, I wonder if you would like to speak to that, particularly thinking around your kind of interactions with particular kinds of culture setting by men in power or sort of coded maintenance of masculine power and white privilege. I wonder if that's something you could speak to.
Yeah, and definitely seeing this play out a lot, especially across my time working across the justice system and that as well, and seeing that power shift and them sorts of things as well. But I must say as well is I do believe that we are in an area of change as well, and we see a lot of change coming in across the different areas and different things across the place. And people understanding better, understanding culture and Aboriginal culture and that as well. We still need to do better, and we still need to understand that, and especially that domination of the power and I suppose the Adam Goods was a really big thing for everyone, and the booing and all that sort of stuff. With the work that we do is we challenge that as well. When it came out, I'll share this story. What we actually did is we heard a few comments and different things and playing footy and around the footy field, and people would always ask me, what do you think about Adam Goods? What do you think about this and the different scenarios? So what we actually did is we actually hired the movie. We got a blow-up cinema from Melbourne, and what we did is we come out and we put it on the lawns out the front of Wulgunggo Ngalu, and we had an open-air cinema, and we invited the local community out, which was attended by about 150 people across it. And from there, we did a welcome. We shared stories of our men within the program, the changes that they're undergoing, where they've come from, where they're moving forward, and that as well. And then we also showed the Adam Goodes movie, The Australian Dream, and challenged that whole notion of the booing in that as well. Our men were really excited, our Aboriginal men in the program. There was 12 of them at the time, and what they actually did is they researched his war cry dance and the meaning behind it. And what they did is they interpreted it themselves, and they danced that dance for the crowd that were there, the dance that sparked off all that talking and all that scenario and that as well, and explained to them, the understanding of it and the way it was. So then what we've seen in that is we've seen a real shift. We've seen a real shift within the community, people coming up and talking and saying how great that was and how beneficial it was to watch a movie in that setting and that as well. But the real winners come back to our fellas that had the opportunity to share culture and share it in that really positive life. Now, we're talking about men that have been probably some men have been incarcerated, some are on corrections orders, they've definitely all been in trouble in that as well. But that real strength and that real growth within them to be able to achieve something at that level that was really, really powerful and a real change within the culture. And that's what we say about passing on the knowledge is one of our cultural protocols within the program. We learn stuff and we pass it on.
Yeah. Thanks, Shaun. That's such a great story and such an important example to be able to share of what meaningful connection and change can look like. And it leads me really well into the last question that I have for you, for each of you. So reflecting on these potential pathways for social transformation or for structural change, what do you personally hope for in the future in terms of reworking these narratives and this storytelling of men and masculinity within Australia? And what does change in this space look like for you? And if you'd like to sort of weave in some finishing remarks, that would be great. So Tarang, I'll turn to you first.
Wow, I mean, I need to answer your question with another question, which is how much time do we have, right? Like, how long can we talk for? I think that from my perspective, we need to acknowledge at the one time that there is, that disproportionately society has benefited men, but also create space to acknowledge that it's a certain kind of man that has been prioritized and benefited, and then from that create opportunity. I think that we need to have opportunity for more men to feel comfortable and vulnerable in themselves, and whatever their expression of their gender identity looks like, create space for that. And I think that when we do that, or if we're able to do that, we will ultimately create a society that is safer at once for men in terms of the rates of male on male violence, the rates of men's mental health and suicide and other issues that impact men and men alone, but also create a space that is, and this is key, safer for the women that live around men and the gender diverse groups that live around men, because we cannot ignore or refute the fact that the statistics have shown that a certain type of man has benefited in society for so long. That's why we still have issues like the gender pay gap. That's why we still have issues of male intimate partner violence. That's why we still have the need for things like the March for Justice earlier this year. That's why we still have so many women and men who stand beside them and other gender diverse groups who are so angry, with the mistreatment of people at the hands of men. So I think that we need to, in order to take the next step, create space for and room for men to explore. And when I say that, I mean really like starting quite young. I think it starts at, in terms of how we socialize boys to grow into men. I think that if we create space at that level, even from like early childhood into primary school, and then teaching them the right things in high school and onwards, and creating space to listen to them, I think we'll have opportunity. I think with opportunity comes the prospect of a better future. Otherwise, I think we'll just continue to see these statistics play out for years to come, which none of us want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tarang, and well done summarising our hopes for the future in a couple of minutes. Lech, the same question for you. What does change in this space look like for you?
Well, yeah, all of that stuff in terms of the conversations that we're having with with men or boys from a really young age, because a lot of these conversations don't end up popping up until the end of high school, in terms of having those really honest conversations around mental health and around vulnerability. And I think that's too late. Like I think you really need to it really needs to be normalized from the youngest possible age. You've obviously need to judge what kind of conversation and how advanced it needs to be, but like you need to really normalize the ability to open up about your emotions, and that will feed into the more advanced conversations that you have at a later age. In terms of more broadly, I think that it's not just about finding new male role models. It's also about finding role models from right across the spectrum, right across the gender spectrum, and elevating them. And so that this when we talk about this Australian larrikin, who generally is a smattering of athletes and politicians and people with power who exhibit very similar personality traits. We need to expand that so that we have all different kinds of role models, and so that these young boys who are growing up and might be benefiting from more vulnerability, like the ability to have conversations about different sort of stuff, that they aren't constantly measuring themselves against these idols, of a very specific type. And so that this it goes hand in hand. And so that means that the sort of political leaders that we have, if we make them more reflective of Australian society, and allow different kinds of people emerge into those positions, I think that will have a big effect on the wider society, because it allows people growing up to see these examples of communication, of compassion, of vulnerability, and instead of this quite outdated, really sort of blokey, quite emotionally shut off sort of character who's really dominated our national space. And so, yeah, I think that there's, as Strang said, there's a million different things that need to be done, but I think that there is increasing space for this different type of personality, and I think that, yeah, politics is actually lagging behind where society is to a certain extent, and so I think that political parties really need to take the lead, and yeah, really change the template for leadership, and I think that will hopefully start to reflect where society is already sort of hungering to get to that point anyway. So yeah, I really hope to see a different kind of leader emerge over the next sort of decade.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Lech. And Shaun, same question for you. When you're reflecting on these kind of pathways for social change, what are you hoping for in the future, and what does change look like for you?
Yeah, well, definitely. Me being a father, and I have three girls. I have a 12-year-old and twin girls that are 9, and a little son as well. That's 2 years old. So for me, reflecting back is I don't want my narrative to be their narrative. The way that we grew up and the struggles that we faced and the things that we had to go through to get where we are. So providing that love and the care, and ensuring they understand their cultural connection, their cultural pathway as well, and very important for my young son and that as well. I'm sure that he's going to grow up pretty balanced with his three sisters and his mum around, and especially the work that I do as well. We do a lot of work out here around a white world and a black world, so an Aboriginal world and a white world, and we have to live in the white world. Yeah, but we still have to have that cultural connection, that connection to ceremony, that connection to dance, and I would like to see that. I would like to see more of our culture being involved in mainstream culture and that as well, which I think we're slowly getting to in that sort of sense. So I suppose it's some famous words, isn't it, that Nova Peris said, by people accepting, by people accepting our culture doesn't mean that they lose 200 years of their culture. It means that they gain 60,000 years of a culture that's vibrant, living, free, and everything else that falls into that. So that's where I see it a lot, and that's definitely the work that I forge and the work that I do. And the real reason for that is to create that different narrative for my children as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Shaun. And what an important narrative that is, particularly given we started off by highlighting those sort of fundamental intersections of gender, masculinity, and white supremacy in a place like Australia. So thank you. That's taken us to the end of the questions that I have. Before I do wrap up, is there anything that anyone would like to kind of wrap up with or touch on again?
I thought it was fantastic. It was really good. Definitely, I'll walk away taking a bit away from it as well. So thank you.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, it was really great, and I really appreciate, hearing your experience, both of your experiences, and speaking so honestly and openly, and yeah, it was great.
Yeah, likewise. And really great questions as well, Sarah. I think that like often there's the questions can be quite like generic and vague, but these kind of honed in on specific issues around accountability and then the experience of First Nations men, and then other things about like the the Larrikins. So I think that's really, it's been beneficial in terms of honing in on things that people who are listening will identify with, beyond the broader like idea of just I'm a man and kind of lost. I think there's that kind of what do I do about it among the broader population of men. So I think that this is hopefully giving them something to ponder and reflect on in a good way. And I think I've come out learning more than I think I've contributed. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll follow up by just saying I've really enjoyed hearing everything, and I thank you for your openness and your willingness to talk through all of these different things. And I've certainly learnt and have a lot of food for thought as well. So thank you from me. So in terms of wrapping up, I would like to remind our viewers, if this panel has raised any issues for you, or you'd like to talk to someone about violence, safety, or mental health, we'll be sharing the contact details for available support services in a moment. And I'd again like to thank both the Wheeler Centre and Our Watch for inviting me to host tonight's panel, and for inviting our excellent panellists as well. So this event was presented in partnership by the Wheeler Centre and Our Watch as part of the National Media Engagement Program. And as I mentioned earlier, Cameron McDonald from Our Watch will be writing up a reflective essay on the panel, and that will be shared on the Wheeler Centre website along with the recording of our event today. Thanks again to our panellists, Shaun Braybrook, Lech Blaine and Tarang Chawla. It's been such a wonderful time to get to speak with you, and I hope we have more opportunities to talk again soon.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.